Uh, First off, I'm super excited to have Dr. Chris Merritt here with us today. And I'm super excited for you guys as students to get to meet him for several different reasons. But foremost, he does have quite a bit of experience in historic archaeology. And I always feel like we need more representation in this. But just to give you a little bit of his background, he received his PhD from the University of Montana in 2010. With a focus on historical and archaeological excavations of overseas Chinese. This is what I didn't know much about you, Chris, believe it or not. Before that, he received a Master's of Science in Industrial Archaeology from Michigan Technological University, and he was studying trade and consumption there. And specifically, this is what I did know about you, of Mormon-produced pottery in Utah. He has published on this. You can find his work on there, out there on this. And since 2004, Dr. Merritt has actually worked for a variety of professional archaeological settings, and I mean variety. And I cyberstalked you a little bit, hope you don't mind. In addition to some bioinformation that he sent me, he's worked for the United States Forest Service in Utah, Nevada. He's worked for private archaeological firms here in Salt Lake City. And also, and this is where I have known him most, with State Historic Preservation Office here in Utah, for the Utah Division of State History, at the Utah Division of State History, here in Salt Lake City. He's also an adjunct professor, currently teaching at Salt Lake Community College, teaching both historical archaeology and cultural resource management. But these are not the only two classes he has taught in the past. He's also taught historic sites archaeology, which maybe we can bring you here to teach one day. He also has taught archaeological method and theory and also archaeological field school. So he is a dirt archaeologist, and much like myself. And not only that, he is currently the State Historic Preservation Officer for the state of Utah, which is kind of like the head honcho of our historic preservation program here in the state. One of the main reasons one of the main reasons I wanted to invite him, other than I know him intimately, right? As Dr. Hickman mentioned, and he's a good guy and he's got lots of fun stuff to say and he's really approachable. But as a State Historic Preservation Officer, number one, he's a good person to get to know. And although we're virtual and we're not meeting as we typically do in the setting where we bring our speakers out and you guys get to meet him in person, he could be a future or potential employer for you in the future, number one. But number two, if you work in any of these agencies that I mentioned that Chris has worked for, or any other agencies that might hire you as an archaeologist or even as an anthropologist in the future, you will likely have to work with him if you do anything in the state of Utah, as Dr. Merritt he oversees our whole historic preservation program, including the preservation of archaeological and cultural heritage sites. So without further ado, I'll turn the time over to Dr. Merritt. I'll give you a silent clap. Welcome.
I'll take the golf clap any day. So thanks, Mike, for the great intro. I'm excited to speak to you all. And I have to say that, Mike and Jim Allison are, some of the closest colleagues I have here in the academic world. And you know what? BYU is the only major university that asked me to come speak to them. So you know what? You guys are awesome. I appreciate it. So as Mike said, I'm an archaeologist by training, and it's kind of fun to do my job because I do get to see the entire depth and breadth of Utah's history, 13,000-year-old sites, all the way up to, we're working right now on some projects with mid-century modern housing and trying to get those identified and listed to the National Register. So, really spanning the entire breadth of Utah's history. And so I know there's a little bit of different backgrounds here. So, and so I want to maybe put a bigger picture of who we are, how we function, but I'm going to share my screen if I can, because I created a little PowerPoint with visuals, because you don't want to look at me for this entire time. And Mike and Jacob said I have 4.5 hours for you guys to get your extra credit today. So I'm going to try to fill that as much as I possibly can. So I know there's some anthropology majors. I know there's some history majors. And so what I wanted to first kind of put is like, who are we? How do we function in what I tell my students, the ecosystem of historic preservation? And so I work for the Utah Division of State History. Our office is downtown in the Rio Grande Depot. But a lot of my students are kind of surprised that the state employs archaeologists. I'm like, well, they actually employ more than that. We employ architectural historians. We employ historians. We employ an architect. We employ, you know, planners, you know, all these folks that kind of live in this larger ecosystem of historic preservation. And so my office is called the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office. And this is within state history. State history is just the overall organization that we are a part of. But this is an important program, SHPO. And it's not just because I'm the boss of it. That's not the only reason it's important. If you go back to 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act, which was passed by Congress, you know, was spearheaded by Lady Bird Johnson, the wife of Lyndon Baines Johnson, our president at the time. It was really this nationwide statement that we need laws in place to protect, preserve, and plan for our historic resources. Throughout the 50s and early 60s, we saw tons of interstate construction during the Eisenhower years, or reservoirs and dams, or urban renewal and blighting in a lot of our, you know, most historic downtown neighborhoods. And so many communities saw these really important pieces of their past just being leveled for parking lots, for interstate development. And the federal agencies spearheading this had no compulsion, no reason to think about what they're doing and why they're doing it, and if they could avoid some of those impacts. And so the National Historic Preservation Act mandated that. It mandated that these federal agencies had to take into account their actions. Well, one of the great things that was part of this act, and I consider it a really great federalist law in this sense, is that while this was a federal law, it actually created every state and territory, and subsequently a few decades later, tribal organizations can create a SHPO office, a state historic preservation office, whose mandate is to be within state government to advise, assist, oversee those federal projects, and also to be the voice of the Utah public and also the voice of the governor of the state. And so this is powerful. This means that all 50 states have an office like mine, where we employ this really broad variety of humanity in all these different disciplines. And we're supposed to be the experts. We're supposed to be the spearheaders. We're supposed to be the folks saying, you know, these are what agencies need to be doing for preservation, but also just doing this more broad, why things need to be preserved. Why are we interested in saving these historic places? And that's pretty cool. Most of us that get to go into history or archaeology, you know, your jobs are working for consultants or maybe directly for the agencies, where you have a lot more boundaries on what you can say, what you can do with your time. Academics live in this ecosystem too, and we're all kind of living together, but my office, just by its nature, is kind of at the center. Kind of as Dr. Sears said, is everybody comes to us. Everybody has to have us review their work. I don't have regulatory authority in the sense that I can't say you can't widen I-15, but we have a say. You know, can you choose an alternative that, you know, causes us to lose less historic homes? Or could you build a transmission line to avoid more of our archaeological resources? And so our office is in a pretty unique position. So that 1966 law also created the SHPO. So there's an office and then there's a person, and the person is appointed by the governor of the state. December of 2019, I was appointed by Governor Herbert to be Utah's SHPO, which is a great honor. You know, that I was an archaeologist. I was running the archaeology side of the office for about 8 years to that point. And so this title gave me authority over both the historic buildings, the above ground and below ground resources under one overarching umbrella. And to me, that's very exciting, because we built these silos over decades of you do yours, I do mine. I consider a historic building interesting once it's leveled, and then it's archaeology. Just joking. I like to use that on the architects. They don't like that joke. But I love historic buildings. And I got into archaeology because I love all of history, not just one little weird slice. And so this gave me an opportunity to reshape our program and start saying we're all one big community of preservationists. And there's so few of us that creating silos is doing nobody any good. And so one of my major goals is to do more outreach, to do more education, to see if we can save more of these buildings, save more of these sites before you know, bad things happen to them. So I'm excited. I'm also the very first archaeologist to hold this position in the state of Utah. and even nationwide, of one of 2 archaeologists that hold the position of SHPO, just because so many of the other SHPO programs focused on the built environment. So I feel pretty lucky that I have this platform to uh, teach about archaeology and preserve archaeology, but being part of this larger preservation community. So this is our home. If you have not been down to the Rio Grande Depot, built in 1911, home of the Rio Grande and Denver Rio Grande and Western Railway, beautiful building, absolutely spectacular inside. I am privileged to have an office in this. A lot of people didn't know there's state offices in here. There's actually almost 70 employees for the state of Utah that are in this building in normal times. Right now, because of both the pandemic and the earthquake, which is the second part of this presentation, there's only a skeleton crew. And as you can see, I'm at home and not at our home downtown. So before I jump into the programs I administer as the SHPO, I wanted to talk a quick second about the other programs that State History has outside of SHPO. And what's really lovely is I have this ability to interact with all these really diverse programs, and we're all still doing the same thing. We're promoting and learning from history. And just as some of those future talks, that there's lessons in history and we need to learn from them, and everybody has their little piece to play. We're home of the Utah Historical Society, which was actually founded in the 19th century, and they've published a quarterly journal since 1929. We have an annual history conference, which I know, Mike, you've come to before. We're going to have it virtual this year, talking about public health. So if there's anybody in this world that maybe wants to present some research you've done on public health from a historical perspective, whether it's, pandemics, epidemics, mental health, any sort of things that has a historical perspective, please check us out. We're looking for more presenters. We have 2 historians that work in that program. We have the State Historical Society's collections. So we have 400, 500,000 photos, we have manuscripts, we have 50,000 maps. A lot of the stuff is not digitized, which is a common issue in all our repositories. But when you're doing history research, don't forget us. We're a state institution, and we have a strong relationship with state archives, which they handle the governmental records, so birth records, death records, old laws and communications. So we have a great research center. It's right there in the lobby of the Rio Grande. They are open right now for research, but it's by appointment only, as you could understand. National History Day, which is a really fun program. This is a statewide program that tries to engage 4th through 12th graders in history-based education. And so it really leverages local teachers to, we're going to put our class through this, and you can do presentations, exhibit boards, dramatic plays, websites, documentaries. And some of the stuff these kids make is incredible. Last year, 2 years ago, a National World War II award was given to Utah for a girl here in Salt Lake Valley who did a paper on her great-grandfather who was part of World War II's Ghost Army. And you probably maybe saw that in the press. Well, that story only came to light because she did a story on it. She did her project on it. And the great-grandfather never even thought it was something interesting that anyone would care about. But man, did it hit the national news. So this is a really great program that we administer. And we're always looking for judges. We're always looking for, educators out in the world. So if you have some folks like that, please connect them. We have a cemeteries and burials program. We have been mandated by the legislature to maintain a database of burials throughout the state. And so we do have a pretty robust program right now. Our program administrator, this is one person, has actually just expanded our offerings to include preservation-based grants, meaning that if a community sexton or a cemetery person wanted to do some restoration work on some tombstones or a portion of the cemetery, we have some grants available there. Because again, that's another part of preserving our history, is those that came before us. And then the last one I want to highlight, Monuments and Markers Database. Back in Utah's centennial year, 96, the legislature instructed us to create a comprehensive database of all the monuments and markers. So Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, Sons of the Utah Pioneers, all these markers, because these are seen as sort of place-based histories. Some are, very outdated. Just last week at the Bear River Massacre Memorial on January 29th, the DUP had swapped out an older marker that had kind of been very biased against the Native American part of the story. And so they replaced the marker with something that was a little bit more appropriate, more historically accurate, and something more sensitive to the Northwestern Band of Shoshone, who lost almost their entire tribe that day in 1863. So monuments and markers, as you probably have heard, nationwide with Civil War monuments and all this stuff. It's a very hot topic. We do have a database, and we're looking to probably do some outreach to see if we can gather more markers that have been established since '96. So let's talk about my programs real quick. And we have a couple. The first I want to highlight is our certified local government. Provo is a certified local government through our office. So when Congress told us to run a SHPO program, they mandated that we create these on-the-ground partners, cities and counties, to deliver those historic preservation needs at that lowest level of government. And so to do this, we've created this program where a community can register, there's a commission, and we give grants. We're actually required by federal law to pass through 10% of our budget to these local communities. We are number one in the country in the number of local governments that have partnered with us. We're now at 100 CLGs, which is exciting. These grants are non-competitive, just because we know we want Sanpete County to have the same access to these grants as Salt Lake City, just because the impact of $10,000 from us can mean a lot more in a rural community. We have one person that manages this program, and so she works with all our local partners, and we do these grant cycles right now. Right now, we're closing this year. National Register of Historic Places. A lot of people know this. They see the plaques on the side of cool old buildings. This is listed on the National Register. Well, we administer that program. We have one full-time person that reviews these nominations that are being spurred by communities or property owners. And it's just a recognition that these places are important. Now, we do get the black helicopter crowd that says, I don't want my building on no federal register because the government's going to take it. Well, it doesn't work that way. The National Register was created as an honor to the property. There's no restrictions that come with it to the property owner. So you could list it and demolish it the next day. But the thought of listing on the National Register is that it opens up opportunities. One, if it's listed on the National Register, a community could use our CLG grants to do rehabilitation work on it, but it has to be listed. Or, segue, tax credits. If your historic home or business is listed on the National Register, you've made the first step toward being eligible to make a tax credit application. So we facilitate two. We have a state tax credit and a federal tax credit. Federal tax credit is for income producing properties. So big apartment buildings, big office buildings. And then we have a state one, which is smaller, but those are for residential properties. And I knew I was going to sneeze. So the state tax credit, is really a small dollar amount, $10,000 investment, but it's really trying to incentivize people taking care of their historic places. And to get those tax credits, you need to meet standards of preservation. And we have a coordinator that helps, over 120 people a year in the state and up to 11 in the federal per year. Technical assistance, that's one of our jobs. These poor communities in rural parts of Utah don't have access to an architectural firm, or they don't have access to an architectural historian or an archaeologist. Part of our job is to be that technical assistance, to go to those communities and say, what can we do to help? We employ a licensed architect. We only have one of 4 architects in all of state government, and his job is to meet with communities and give them free licensed architectural advice so they can make the next steps without finding those funds to hire a firm and to pay for it out of pocket. So we try to offer those services. Records is another program area. Don't worry, there's only part 2s of these slides. We have a lot of programs, but I limited it to 2. Part of that same 66 Act was to make us, the SHPO, as the state repository for all archaeological and historical information in the state. So that means I have all the archaeological records of every site documented in Utah, regardless if it's federal, state, or private land. And that goes back, we have stuff from the 1920s all the way up to 3,000 to 4,000 new sites a year are coming in. We manage, so those of you that maybe are thinking of other ways to make you attractive for a future career, all the people I employ now in records have a GIS background, Geographic Information Systems background. It's a computer-based mapping program, but it is such a powerful tool, and it is now the industry standard. So when I teach my anthropology students, and I'm sure Mike, you do too, is like, get exposed to GIS. You need to know this skill. It opens up so many more doors in the 21st century of employment. And looking at you historians on the other side, learn this tool too. You know, it helps your job market, and it's also just where we're going of using big data sets to do big analysis and answer interesting historical stories that maybe we didn't accomplish through traditional historical means. So GIS is really important because this is how we manage our data. Very quickly, we have over 100,000 known archaeological sites in the state of Utah. 36,000 and more in just San Juan County alone, as you can imagine. Historic buildings, we have records on about 120,000 historic buildings that we manage. We've finished digitizing all the paper records for archaeology. We're now working on the historic buildings, but Utah County was our pilot project. So Utah County has been completely scanned for historic buildings, and they're open and available. And I'll share this presentation with Mike and Jacob, and they can share it with you, but I'll also include a little fact sheet of some links of where you can learn more about our resources and how you can access these historic building records. Just because you might want to geek out. I like to geek out sometimes too. Outreach and education. We have a fairly robust program that I'm trying to grow. In the Great Recession, we actually lost our 2 public outreach archaeologists to budget cuts. And so it's been a struggle to get those positions back. But by investment in digital technology, I was able to use an old retirement that was doing a paper-based system that now we've automated. Once she retired, I turned that existing position around and created, for the first time since 2011, a public archaeologist, someone that is meant to go out there and talk to the public and preach about how awesome it is and to just grow this community. And she is awesome, and she would be another great presenter for this presentation. Really passionate about preserving our history. She got her master's up at Utah State. With over 10 years of work in the sectors before that. We just hired a cultural site stewardship coordinator, which this is the next exciting part of our wing. Of last legislative cycle, Representative Hawks of Davis County sponsored a bill to create a site stewardship program. Many of our neighboring states have a similar program that connects volunteers, anybody off the street, with sensitive archaeological sites and say, you have an interest, we have a need. When you think about how many archaeologists are in the state, we have about 59 archaeologists managing 30 million acres of public land and those 100,000 archaeological sites. So we need the public's help. We need their assistance. And so this program, which we're going to soft launch in March, is going to connect volunteers who have an interest with sites. We're going to train them how to monitor, how to identify damage, vandalism, looting, and just become that force multiplier of good. And so we just hired this position in November. We're so ecstatic. Great guy. And then the least exciting or sexy of all these program areas, but probably one of the most important from a legal standpoint, is our review and compliance program. So that act, 1966, says we have to review all the federal work. So every time you see UDOT widen a road, every time you see UTA build a new bus stop, every time you see the Forest Service do a prescribed burn, every time you see an oil gas lease, mine development, anything on federal lands or federal money, we're reviewing that for its cultural compliance. So we process between 1,800 and 2,200 cases a year. Our bulk is off Bureau of Land Management property, but UDOT, Forest Service, Bureau of Reclamation, all these agencies, none of you have probably heard of in any systematic way, work with our office, using our records, doing new inventories, hiring private sector archaeologists, which is the big sector for hiring in our industry. About 92% of all archaeologists in the state of Utah are private sector, not agency like myself or academic like Mike. So we're in an ecosystem, but all this stuff comes through us. That's why we are the place of the repository. So those were sort of our big program areas. I'm just going to gloss over these individual slides because I probably already put half of you to sleep already, which is perfectly fine. We have 1,400 National Register listed properties in the state of Utah. I already said kind of this, why list it? Honor and recognition, incentives, and compliance. So UDOT has to take into account their actions on historic properties or something that are listed on the eligible for the National Register. That's why it's critical for us to know about these places. So hopefully early in a planning process, we can avoid any impacts. Now I'm going to come back to the Magna example here in a minute. Local government, $10,000 grants. These grants can be used for planning purposes, feasibility studies, brick and mortar work, and even interpretive. A lot of communities now are doing walking tours, but now moving it to an online platform. So Salt Lake City has a really great, robust walking tour where you can tour the city and listen about the history of all these different places. Tax credits. Well, you already heard me say it. It's daunting, and probably most of you going to school aren't homeowners, but maybe you know somebody that could use this. We want to spread this. Our state tax credit in particular has been really focused in what I would consider middle class and more affluent white neighborhoods, and I don't like that. This is a program that should be applicable to across the entire state and all demographics. And so we're focusing a lot of our attention this year and next year in bridging community gaps with the Latinx community, the African American community, and finding ways to get these being heavily used by a more diverse public. Because again, there's so few of us interested in preservation and sponsoring it. We need to grow our constituents. We need to say that preservation has a seat for every person in Utah, not just affluent white neighborhoods. And then public outreach, which I already mentioned, our 2 programs. The Utah Public Archaeology Network is what Elizabeth runs for our public archaeologist program. And then the Cultural Site Stewardship Program, which we're just getting ready to announce. And so look forward to that. If you're interested in visiting cool archaeological sites, but giving back, which I think is something Utah does better than any state in the union, volunteering to help our public land managers monitor and educate the public about how to care for these places, I think is a real big need. And I know there's going to be a lot of people geeking out to help. Big list of contacts. So like I said, I'll share this with Mike and Jacob to talk about who you can reach out to, but we have just a great group of folks. I love working with them. They are literally a team. And we just try to do as much as we can with a very small state office. But we're like the little engine that could. For as few staff as we have, we accomplish a lot. And I'm really excited to let you guys know a little bit about our programs. So before I jump to the next slide, I can't see if anyone's asking questions. So I'm going to jump back real quick. Did anyone have questions on kind of the overview of my program area before I jump a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of the Magna Earthquake?
I would invite students, if you do have questions, use the digital hand raise function. That way Chris will be able to see that you've got your hand raised.
I hope I can.
I made you a co-host, so you should be able to see in the participants.
Okay, so it looks
like, yeah, and for students who don't know how to do that, you go to the little smiley face icon on the bottom row of all the icons, and it looks like Deborah is our first person who has a question. So go for it, Deborah.
Thank you so much for the information. I do like the beard. I think that's cool. But I am interested in purchasing this cute, almost 200-year-old house in American Fork. And I wondered, how do I go about the tax credit? Is that something that I could benefit from? And what would I need to do to get that home restored and get its history? It wasn't owned by somebody famous. And I know some houses in American Fork were owned by famous people, but this one wasn't. So any tips?
Well, that's okay. A lot of those 1,400 individually listed properties are not big and famous people. They're perhaps buildings that are indicative of that period, like a 200-year-old home. Those are rare nowadays. And so just even the architecture itself, even if it's a common architectural style, can make it significant. So yes, I think tax credits could help you. Our architect could actually come down, walk through the property with you, talk about options of how to restore it back to its old days, help you research the home to find maybe historic photographs of it. But yeah, I think, we would be able to more than willing to help you do some of those assessments. I mean, already it sounds like you're most of the way there. Okay, any other questions? And Deborah, hopefully that helped.
Yes, thank you so much. Do I just look in the list that you just posted? I took a screenshot. Is that the right place to go to connect with the architects of the state? Okay, thank you.
Yep. So I would probably start with an email to, on this sheet, Amber Anderson and Steve Cornell, and with an address of the property you're looking at, and let them take you away. Okay. Don't see any more hand raising, but I don't know if I'm using the function right.
I'll let you know if I see any others, if you want to move ahead. But we're definitely going to open it up to Q&A at the end. Oh, there's Jordan. Jordan has a question.
Go for it, Jordan.
Hi, wonderful presentation, Chris. I'm wondering if you could maybe like, does your agency have anything to do as well with like preservation of Native American burials and the issue around things like archaeological theft of those sites? And maybe you could address that issue.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jordan. So yeah, Native American burials do fall into our broader suite of projects that we wrangle. One thing I didn't really cover in this slide, because it's not a normal SHPO program, is we do have the Ancient Human Remains program. And what this program is, there's a state law that protects unmarked burials from abuse and desecration. And if there's native human remains, ancient native human remains, it falls under this. And so if people are out grave robbing, it's actually a class 3 felony under state law. And so we do have 2 physical anthropologists on staff that respond to a farmer digging an irrigation ditch, finds a bone. Our office will actually go respond, recover those human remains, and work with the tribes to try to get those repatriated to somewhere more appropriate and safe. Now, as far as like the enforcement component is, that's an area we're struggling right now. Especially in a lot of parts of rural Utah, local law enforcement doesn't want to go after good old boys for digging up Indian graves. They don't see that as a bad thing or something that's prosecutable. And I'm not saying that's universal. Some counties and sheriff departments take it very seriously, others don't. And that's, I think a lasting issue we need to resolve statewide is these are the dead. And I don't care if they're native or not, like these deserve to be treated with respect, and the goods that they were buried with were meant to be with this person in the afterworld. If I had my personal way, I'd catch the person, take them to the cemetery where their grandparents are, buried, and dig up their grandparents and then take their gold teeth and say, well, how does that make you feel, buddy? But that's me. I'm a little bit more confrontational. But yeah, we do have a role to play in that. And then just general archaeological looting on state lands is against the law, same as it is on federal land. And so we're trying to work with our state law enforcement to also start prosecuting folks that are defacing rock imagery panel or looting archaeological sites, because these things are our shared history if they're on public lands, and that includes state and federal. It's private land in the state, it's yours, unless it's a burial. And then it's still the state law applies. You cannot desecrate that burial if it's on even your own land. So yes, we're engaged in that, but sadly we have a long way to still go. But I don't think Utah is isolated in this transition of thinking about Native American burials. I think there's a lot of states that are still dealing with this legacy of they're the other, therefore I can do bad things to them because they're not my people and no one cares about them. So we're trying to help education that way. So thank you, Jordan, for that question.
Yes, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
So not seeing any questions right now. I want to jump into the second half real quick because I know we're on a time crunch and I want to make sure everyone has questions. Let's talk earthquake. And I want to first show, we're coming up on a year later. And so I want to show what it was like to be in my office. So this is a security camera view of the hallway in the Rio Grande Depot on the morning of March 18th last year. Very quickly, you're going to see my butt hightailing it to the exit, which is the last thing you should be doing. In an earthquake, you should duck and cover. But I spent 8 years in the building that the state risk management said was the #1 highest risk in the entire state of Utah for civilian fatalities. So when the earth started shaking that morning, I'm an early riser, I was out of there. I am not a fast man, but I found motivation to become very fast that day. So we all survived it. You know, we all, and what was really fascinating is when I started interacting with FEMA, they started calling us survivors, which I didn't really think about because there was no one that died in it. But we did have a federally and state declared emergency that we are considered survivors in the eyes of industry and emergency professionals, which is kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. And so I want to highlight a little bit of the damage that we did, how our office was involved in the recovery and analysis portion, but then also like, where do we go from here? So the next time this happens, when I say survivors, I literally mean survivors if there's a bigger earthquake. We don't want a single person to die from an earthquake in Utah. So how can we learn from this sort of wake-up call? So a plan of action. So March 18th was the earthquake thing. I was the only one in the office other than the security guards. So once I made sure he was safe, I contacted all my staff and said, stay home. You know, the week before we had already done the pandemic lockdown, and I don't know why this is being a pain in the butt. Let me see if I can get rid of this weird window that's on my screen. I don't know why it's hating me right now. All right. Sorry about the technological fun. I don't know why it's leaving this giant yellow box on my screen. I don't know if it's on your guys' screen too.
We can see it, but it's not bothering us.
Okay.
We can see most everything else. Yeah, it's very strange.
It seems to be growing too. So yay. March 18th, you know, we stayed home. March 19th, we made a plan. Is part of our office's role is to also be that historic preservation support to our Office of Emergency Management and FEMA. And so that Thursday, that 19th, I was in contact with the governor's office, with the Office of Emergency Management, and contact our FEMA folks back in Denver saying, hey, we're on it, we got it going. My staff made a plan. And so we decided, this is me being interviewed for KSL Radio on March 20th. And so on March 20th, we hit the ground. And so I divided up both my archaeology and architectural staff into 3 groups. I went with the main group to Magna, which we had known by this day was the hardest hit by the earthquake. Another group worked in the warehouse district, which is the West Salt Lake, so that I-15 corridor to about 4th West, where we have all those old industrial buildings. And then another crew worked the more residential neighborhoods in Liberty Wells. So that's east of State Street and south of about 1300 South. And so our job was to do quick, rapid assessment of damage and also keeping an eye out for things that are human health and safety risks. But what was really cool is that one day in between, we created an application in-house to allow all of us to be feeding into one shared application. And so on the right is one of my GIS specialists. And on that Thursday, he just spent the whole day developing an application through this Esri application, which is the main flagship for GIS, that we could all independently be adding points, address, even taking photos of the damaged property. And so what was really amazing is over the course of the day, you could log into the application and you could just see all these little dots start appearing as my crews worked throughout the state. Identifying high risk, low risk. And then because it was already in GIS, we were able just basically that same afternoon, package it up, send it to our emergency managers. So they had the same data we had in almost instantaneous fashion. And that's why I said like GIS is such a powerful tool for this kind of work. And we were able just to do it right off our smartphones. All of us just downloaded the app and were able to cruise. We uploaded data of the boundaries of known historic buildings. And so we were able to very quickly do rapid assessment while doing all these emergency management data sharing efforts. So this is inside the Rio Grande Depot. So that hallway, picture of me running, the 2 wings that are 2-story talls, they did fairly well. That main big lobby that's almost 60 feet tall, that's where the most of the damage was, because that's all unreinforced masonry. So during the earthquake, that thing was just shimmying and shaking for all it's worth. And so we had extensive damage. We have still not started the repairs yet because of the need to do extensive planning. We're probably hopefully going to start doing some construction work this summer, but we're going to be out of the office for a whole nother year, regardless of the pandemic situation. Some of our collection spaces did take some damage. Some of our earthquake shelving, where our manuscripts and books did collapse. We had some limited damage in the basement, but overall, we got pretty unscathed. No injuries and no major loss of our archival material, which is all in the basement of a 1911 railroad station. But downstairs, you didn't even notice that the earthquake had occurred because all the damage was up high where the buildings were swaying. Magna. This is where I went with some of my team on that morning, because we knew this from the stories, this was the hardest hit. And what's amazing is very little in Magna had actually been inventoried for historic resources or listed. And so as I circle back, this was both lemons and lemonade that we tried to do. So this is Colosseums Stories. This is probably one of the oldest anchor businesses in downtown Magna. Because it's been a long-term owned by an Italian-American family for now almost 60 years, makes sausages and other sort of fine Italian meats. They lost a good portion of their western, eastern-facing wall. This was a union hall that was actually an old dome structure that they put a brick veneer on. That just completely peeled off. And then the picture on the left is actually the back corner of the Magna Mining Museum, which is another great treasure that very few people know about. But that old brick building took a beating too. And some of the old issues of not keeping it up is coming back to haunt them. As we move more into the rest of the valley, we saw other issues. So this is an adobe home in the warehouse district. You can see the gray adobe bricks there in the exposed eave of the gable. Well, adobe is just loaf, it's basically sun-fired clay. And so during this shaking event, those bricks aren't well supported, so they cracked. The stucco that had applied over them, which is one of the worst things you can do to brick and adobe, is to actually put this awful stucco on it because it wicks moisture in and out. But that shattered, exposing more of the adobe. So that was another type of damage that we identified. This is another one that made the news. This is right next to the homeless shelter on 4th West, and that whole parapet, when we say parapet, is this part of the building. That whole parapet collapsed below, which somehow, usually every morning when I came in, there's many homeless folks that are walking out of getting their morning breakfast or still camping in this area. Thankfully that morning no one was there, because there definitely would have been fatalities had there been folks there. This one we just found by random. This is an apartment complex, and you'll notice that circle and then the zoom in on the right, that is an unsafe condition for a 4-story tall brick chimney. And you can see a person just calmly walking underneath it. So that's one that I got on the phone directly to Salt Lake County Emergency Management, and they closed that whole section of this apartment building down because it was a health and human safety risk until that could be stabilized. The Crane building, or you might know it as the Chili Teppan building, which is a great restaurant if you haven't tried it. This huge structural crack. Now, this is going to take a lot more work to fix, and I know they're already still assessing it, but basically the whole building just shifted slightly, exposing that whole column to a major structural crack. That one was pretty scary as well. This, of all the examples, this is the one house we lost. This was the Septimus Sears house in Liberty Wells. This is the oldest home in that neighborhood, dating to the late 19th century. And what really stinks is that there was a new homeowner. They had spent basically all the previous 2019 doing work to the interior, starting to repair a lot of stuff that had not been taken care of. And then the earthquake just destroyed 2 corners of this building. And what's funny with this architecture, not funny, but it's actually an adobe interior wall with a brick veneer. And so those weren't tied together. So during that earthquake, those two just basically peeled apart and collapsed. And so this major gable failed. And so the property owner, we met with them several times. We tried to offer some plans, but it kind of reached that point that they didn't have the funds to do the restoration work anymore. So this building has been demolished, which is a true shame. Just because a lot of folks came to us desperately, like, how do we get money for this? And we have tax credits. We don't have actual, funds to help homeowners. And FEMA took nearly 6 months to arrive with their federal, which is actually speedy for FEMA, with their federal support. So that's one thing I'm trying to find ways to think of for the future, the next event. How do we not have this happen again? This one's maybe more annoying to see with that yellow box, but this was sort of the output of our mapping effort. The blue is the historic districts in downtown Salt Lake. The red were buildings that we identified as damaged. This is Magna off to the far left, and there was the epicenter of the 5.7 earthquake. So most of it was concentrated in downtown and then Magna. But if you think about it, this part, the west side of Salt Lake Valley, aren't really what we call unreinforced masonry buildings. They're not brick and adobe. These are typically wood frame structures from the mid 20th century. So they weren't as likely to be damaged as some of these other structures. So everything I want to talk about real quick came from our reporting. We identified 145 during that rapid assessment on the Friday, and it ranged from warehouses, industrial, residential, all the way to commercial. The most common damage were chimney fails, which you think about driving around those neighborhoods, you see these, maybe 8-foot tall brick chimneys. Well, those were just the things that fell over. And so while that isn't major damage, those cost the homeowner several $1,000s. And if they came through the roof, what if someone had been down below? So chimney fails was our number one. Parapet fails. So those are those unsupported brick rims around the tops of some of the older commercial and industrial buildings. Those failed because they're unsupported. Major structural cracks, like I showed you. Wall failures were slightly less common, but still common enough to put in here. And then clapping. This is something I learned from our architect. So this picture is 2 different buildings, and those walls aren't tied together. So during the earthquake, the 2 buildings were basically just smacking each other together. And so we're trying to think creatively, like, how do we prevent some of that? And so there are some jointage we could do to these types of buildings to limit that clapping, because that just would cause a lot of damage as well. So what did we learn from this? Communication is key. Having that network of people I knew in the emergency realm really helped me facilitate information, but there was still lots of disconnects and things that were very frustrating, especially when we found some unsafe conditions and you didn't know who was on first. Unreinforced masonry, that was the number one damage, especially those that were over a story tall. Chimneys were collapsing. We also think that we might have had an interesting event of microgeology playing in a factor. In some parts of Liberty Wells, one block had a lot of damage, next block with the same type of buildings, no damage. And so we're working with FEMA and Utah Geological Survey to say, what's underneath those blocks? Was that an old riverbed from Mill Creek or Red Butte? Why did the soils act differently in this event? And then fix the bricks. There is a program that Salt Lake City's had funded by FEMA where homeowners can get money in advance to try to stabilize their building. But they've had the program for almost 10 years. Only about 40 people have taken advantage of it just because of the cost. And so this is something before the magnitude 7 that's predicted, we need to do statewide. We need to do in these core neighborhoods. So not only are we saving these cool historic buildings, but we're also potentially saving lives. By this damage, collapse, and all this stuff. And even then, the best seismic work is not seismic, invincibility. You still get damage with all the seismic retrofit, but you go from failure to damage. You go from fatality to injury, which is an important part of our story. And so the happy end, what I like to say is, during my interactions with Magna, it was very clear this was already a depressed economic community before the earthquake, and they were going to have a long struggle to get recovered. Pandemic plus earthquake plus their economics before both. So we used some end of year funds, which is the first time in my SHPO days that we were able to do this. We hired a consultant to list all of downtown on the National Register. This opens up tax credits and tourism and investment to that downtown. So leveraging this little investment from us to maybe bring back a really cool downtown, like the Empress Theater is such a cool, iconic part of this main street. So we work closely with them. to do this. They're very excited, and they're making preservation a key part of their recovery because they feel like they have such a unique community when you drive around the valley. And then, of course, the next big thing, preparing for the next one. We need to be increasing our seismic retrofitting through Fix the Bricks, private investment, whatever we can do, preservation and health and human safety, but also making people aware of all the educational resources that are out there from all the different agencies. So the Magna Earthquake, I'm an archaeologist. I wasn't, my third month on the job being over both programs, I did not expect to be in a pandemic dealing with an earthquake that damaged historic buildings. But, I had a great staff, and we executed what I would say a masterful response. And, I'm so happy for the work that my crew did on those days and how we're able to help people and communities recover. So, questions. So this is the other part of my life. So what Mike talked about is, my experience with the Chinese in Montana. We actually did the first ever excavation of a Chinese dwelling on the Transcontinental Railroad in U.S. history, was out here in Western Box Elder County. We did it during the pandemic in May with volunteers, but it was an awesome, awesome experience. I have a great relationship with the Chinese community, and they were just stoked to have their story being highlighted and told and preserved. Because going back to one of the questions, this area has been hard hit by looters, people coming for bottles and shiny objects, and it's basically just destroyed the heritage of the Chinese who built the Transcontinental Railroad. So part of my other life is like, okay, let's get out there, preserve what we can, engage the public in helping us preserve this part, because it's just not bottles and cans. This is somebody's heritage. This is somebody's ancestor that, due to systemic racism in the 19th century and then omission from history books in the 20th century, those objects are the only things that can maybe tell the story and connect living people to the past and share a very powerful story during that process. So I like to end with a cool trestle. Those piles were installed in 1871, and those train tracks ran trains from 1869 all the way into 1942. Okay, I'll stop yammering now.